Hello, and welcome to Chapter 2 of The Train to Impossible Places. An unexpected visitor. Susie wasn't sure, at first, what woke her. She was just awake, in that sudden, surprising way that catches your brain unawares, as though it hadn't realised it had been asleep to begin with. The clock on her bedside table read 2 a.m. She sat up, waiting for her eyes to adjust to the dark and tell her what was wrong. After almost a minute, the answer seemed to be nothing. But she was wide awake, and a troubling little itch at the back of her mind told her there was a good reason. She swung her feet out of bed into her slippers, then crept to the window, easing the curtain aside to peer out. The street was deserted, the houses dark and sleeping. No traffic hummed, no people spoke. Even the clouds, vague and shadowy in the overcast night, were still. She was just getting back into bed when she heard it. A sharp, hard noise from somewhere inside the house. She jumped in shock. It came again. A clank of metal on metal, like heavy saucepans being smashed together. Her parents wouldn't be up in the middle of the night banging pots and pans together. Which meant only one thing. There was someone else in the house. The sound drew Susie towards the door, her chest tight with apprehension. Burglars! The thought came crashing into her mind, huge and urgent and dangerous, and it froze Susie to the spot. She tried to shift it, to send it away somewhere, but it refused to budge. What if they'd come upstairs? Her heart beat a stuttering rhythm in her chest, and she realised she was beginning to panic. Nice show not tell there. This wouldn't do. If the burglars, or whoever they were, burst into her room, she didn't want them to find her just standing there in her pyjamas, and not even her nice pyjamas, the dark blue ones with the lightning bolts on them. No, these were her spare set, the pink and yellow ones with the lacy cuffs that her Auntie Sandrine and Marisha sent her for Christmas last year. If they found her like this, they wouldn't have to hurt her. She'd probably drop dead of embarrassment. She clearly needed to do something. But what? Despite her fear, Susie closed her eyes and forced herself to breathe deeply. It wasn't much, but it calmed the storm inside her mind, just enough to let her hear the thought that had been there all along, calling for her attention. Burglars don't make noise. At least, not this much noise. And never on purpose. You couldn't expect to steal much if you woke everyone up. So, probably not burglars then. This reassured her a little, but she was still tense as she crossed to her bedroom door and eased it open, taking her dressing gown down from its hook as she did so. The noise was deafening, even out here on the landing. Definitely not burglars, she decided. If she didn't know any better, she would say it was builders. But what would builders be doing in her house in the middle of the night? No, it was her mum and dad. It had to be. But what on earth were they up to? The light in the hallway was on, but looking down the stairs from the landing, Susie couldn't see much. The noise was getting louder, though. Too loud for pots and pans, although it was definitely the sound of metal striking metal. She crept down the first few steps and was about to peer through the banisters into the hall when a cascade of orange sparks leaped into the air from somewhere below her, ricocheting off the ceiling and walls. She flinched and almost toppled over, but grabbed the banister just in time. "Mum?" Her voice shook. "Dad? Is that you?" The hammering sound stopped immediately, and she heard someone gasp. There was the noise of something heavy being dropped and a sudden scuffle of feet on the hall carpet. Then a rustle and a flap, like bedsheets being folded. Then silence. "Hello?" Susie leaned over the banister, wary of another eruption of sparks, and looked down into the hall. At first, everything seemed normal. But then a glint of metal caught her eye. 2 long silver strips winked up at her from the carpet. They lay side by side, a metre or so apart, and seemed to run into the house from underneath the front door. Susie frowned in confusion, her fear momentarily forgotten, as she descended the stairs, trying to understand what she was seeing. They were railway tracks. She knew they couldn't be, and yet there they were. She prodded the nearest one with her toe, then kneeled down and rapped her knuckles against it. It was cold and hard, and very, very real. A railway line set into the floor of the hall. Someone had even cut strips of carpets away to make room for the tracks. She could see their frayed edges. But that doesn't make sense, she said to herself, stepping back and giving them a hard look. They glinted back at her, indifferent. She turned and followed the path with her eyes, past the living room door and down the whole length of the hall towards the kitchen, where her attention fell on an object sitting to one side of the kitchen door. It was a workman's tent, made of grubby red and white striped tarpaulin, the sort she had seen erected over holes in the road when people had to dig up gas mains or water pipes. They were usually small, but this one was minute. It sagged a bit in the middle, and it barely reached her shoulder. Light spilt from between the canvas flaps. "Mum? Dad?" she called, taking a cautious step forward. Something shifted inside the tent, and a vague shadow played across the fabric. "Who's in there?" "Nobody," replied a hoarse voice that she did not recognise. "There's nobody in here. Go back to bed." There was a stranger in her house. Where were her mum and dad? Why hadn't the noise woken them up too? She took a step back, ready to turn and run. She should call the police or go and fetch help. But whoever this person was, why were they hiding in a tent? And what were those rails doing here? Her mind started to prickle, searching for an answer that didn't seem to be there. Very carefully, she reached out of the house for the house phone, which stood on a small table beside the front door, and lifted it from its cradle. "Tell me who you are, or I'll call the police," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. For a moment, there was no response. Then the voice said, "I'm no one." "Well, you must be someone," she said. "You're talking to me." The voice grunted in obvious annoyance. "No, I'm not. You're dreaming. Go back to bed." Without realising it, Susie took a few steps towards the tent. "If I'm dreaming," she said, "then I'm already in bed." Another grunt, even more annoyed than the last. "Well," she said, creeping closer. "Aha! You could be sleepwalking." The voice sounded rather pleased with itself. "Maybe," said Susie. "That would certainly explain a lot." "There you are then," the voice concluded. "Sleepwalking. Now off to bed with you." Susie took another step, but her toe struck something hard. Ouch! She hopped on one foot and looked down. A squat hammer lay on the floor between the rails. "What happened?" snapped the voice. "What's going on?" "I've just proved to myself that I'm not asleep," said Susie, reaching down to rub her throbbing toe. "That hurt." "Serves you right." Susie thought the voice was starting to sound a little scared. It gave her a bit more confidence. Then she happened to glance over at the living room door, which stood open. There, slumped on the sofa, where she had left them, were her parents, still snoring. "Mum! Dad!" She ran into the living room and shook them. Neither of them woke, but her dad snorted and gave a big, slightly dribbly grin. "More cake?" he muttered. "Just one slice." "Wake up!" she shouted. "You're wasting your breath," said the voice from the tent. "They're out for the count." "What have you done to them?" she said, marching back into the hall, her anger rising. "Me? Absolutely nothing. Anyway, they're happy. Let's just leave 'em dreaming for a bit." Susie threw the phone down, she said. Susie threw the phone down. "Come out," she said, stamping her foot for emphasis. There was a pause. "No. I'm not asking," she said, in her best imitation of her mother. She didn't feel half as fearless as she sounded, but the owner of the voice didn't seem to realise that. "Come out here right now." "Have it your way," muttered the voice. There was more movement inside the tent, and then something poked its nose out between the canvas flaps. It was a nose. the longest, strangest nose that Susie had ever seen. It was as long as her forearm, hooked and flanked by a pair of enormous nostrils, which were filled with wiry grey hair. A broad mouth, as wide as a toad's, was pulled into a sneer beneath it, while two small yellow eyes squinted at her over the top. This strange face was set in a round, bald head, with skin as dark and knotted as old tree bark. A huge pair of pointed ears stuck out on either side. Even more grey hair sprouted from inside them. "Well," said the creature, stepping into full view, "here I am. Take a good look, why don't you?" Susie realised her mouth was hanging open, and she shut it with a snap. The creature, whatever it was, stood almost a head shorter than Susie, and wore orange overalls on its squat body. The name badge pinned to its chest read Fletch. What are you?" stammered Susie. "I'm behind schedule, that's what," said Fletch, elbowing her aside and snatching up the hammer from the floor. "They'll have my ears for slippers if I don't get this connection finished. Out of my way." He slouched past her to the kitchen door, where he stooped and gave the nearest rail an experimental tap with his hammer. "You put these here?" she asked, coming up behind him. "Course I did," he snapped, "and in record time I have, you know." He pulled a tuning fork from the pocket of his overalls, flicked it, and set the stem down on the rail. The fork emitted a high, keening note, and Fletch nodded, apparently satisfied. "Back in the day, I'd have had a whole crew with me, and we'd have been in and out in 5 minutes flat. Blinking cutbacks. This job gets harder every year." Susie listened without really understanding. "But what are they for?" Fletch looked as if he was about to reply, but then paused with his mouth open. "Never you mind. You've already seen too much. You're not even supposed to be here." "Excuse me?" She stamped her foot again, and meant it this time. "I live here." "Which is why you're supposed to be fast asleep and leaving me in peace," he said, getting to his feet. "I don't know how the prep team missed you. They got those other two." He waved the hand in the direction of Susie's sleeping parents in the living room. "They're normally very thorough." "What are you talking about? What prep team?" she said. But Fletch just spun on his heels and marched back to the tent. "I'd make myself scarce if I were you," he said. "Just go upstairs and pretend you didn't see anything. This'll all be gone by morning." And before she could respond, he had ducked inside the tent and disappeared. She stood there until her anger finally overcame her confusion. "Listen," she said. "You can't just turn up in my house in the middle of the night and start telling me what to do. I don't even know what you are. And what about my parents? I demand you wake them up." But if he heard her, he ignored her. She could still see his shadow moving back and forward across the inside of the tent, and heard the sound of rummaging. She considered following him into the tent, but she was still cautious enough not to want to be stuck in this confined space with whatever Fletch was. A gnome? A pixie? Maybe an elf? But that was ridiculous. Those things couldn't exist. And she shook the thought off immediately. All she knew for certain was that Fletch was an intruder, which meant he had to be up to no good. This thought drew her eyes back to the railway tracks. She moved to the kitchen door and pulled it open, wanting to see how far they reached. She was a little surprised to see that they stopped dead right on the threshold of the room. The kitchen floor was untouched. "Excuse me." She was elbowed roughly to one side by Fletch, who had reappeared carrying a black cylindrical rod about the length of a pencil, but much thicker. He swung the door shut again with a crash and began tapping the end of the rod against the door frame. "What are you doing now?" she demanded. "Concentrating," he said, pressing an ear to the wood. "Not my finest work, but it will have to do." Her patience finally at an end, Susie leaned over his shoulder and plucked the rod from his fingers. "Oi!" he shouted, jumping to snatch it back. Susie held it over her head, out of reach. "I'm not giving you this back until you tell me who you are and what you're doing here." she said. That's not a toy, he said, still jumping and waving his arms. You're stealing! Thief! Intruder, she countered, and raised herself up on her tiptoes. That's not fair, Fletch whined, finally coming to a breathless halt. It's sizist. It's perfectly fair, said Susie, trying to maintain some composure. Just tell me, and you can have it back. I promise. Fletch shut one eye and peered at her sideways. Really? Really, but neither of us is going anywhere until you cooperate. Fletch sighed, and his shoulders sagged in defeat. All right, you win, but I hope you realise how much trouble I could get into for this. You're already in trouble. With me. He gave her a resentful look and scuffed a foot back and forth on the carpet. I'm an engineer, he muttered. I maintain the lines and build new ones when they're needed. What lines? What lines do you think? He indicated the track. These lines, the railway lines. Susie blinked. But the nearest railway line is miles away. And anyway, this is a house. You don't get railway lines in houses. Well, not normally, no, said Fletch in a tone of voice that Susie had only ever heard used on other people. It made her feel a bit stupid, and her skin prickled with embarrassment. But we're in a bit of a pickle, you see. The express got held up at those new border controls in the Western Fenlands, and she's got to make it in time for her next delivery. Going by the normal route would take an age, so this is a shortcut. He tapped the side of his great nose. Strictly unofficial, of course. We're not really allowed to set foot in this neck of woods, but here we are for one night only sort of thing. Susie didn't grasp most of what Fletch had said, which only made her feel more frustrated. So she seized on the one nugget she felt sure she'd understood. Railway lines can't just appear and disappear overnight, she said hotly. They can when I'm around, said Fletch with a proud smile. Fastest in the business, me, although at my age I'm starting to feel it a bit. Why, how old are you? Fletch puffed his chest out and affected an air of great dignity. 1,010, he said, and still 2 centuries from retirement. Don't be silly, she said. Nobody's that old. Really? And how old are you exactly? 11, said Susie. Ha! Fletcher's laugh was so explosive that it rocked him back on his heels. So I suppose you know everything then? Susie felt a rush of embarrassment, and hot on its heels a surge of anger. She was so angry that she could hear her blood singing in her ears. Perhaps her feelings showed on her face, because Fletch began backing away from her towards the safety of the tent, his eyes widening. Don't walk away from me, she demanded, but he plunged a hand into his overalls, pulled out an old-fashioned pocket watch, then flipped it open. Crikey, where's the time gone? They're here. Only then did she feel the tremor beneath her feet, and realise that the singing sound she was hearing wasn't coming from her ears at all. It was all coming from the rails. A rush of cold air barreled down the hall, and she turned, thinking that the front door had opened. Instead, it had vanished, and in its place stood an archway of old stone bricks. She just had time to realise that the world that should have been visible outside, the street, the houses, the neat little gardens, was missing, replaced by an echoing black void, before she was blinded by the glare of a huge light racing towards her through the darkness. The scream of a whistle filled the hall, metal ground on metal, and Susie threw herself backwards as the train bore down upon her.